Hey guys, welcome to Relatable. Happy Wednesday. Today we are talking to Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. You've probably seen him over the past few years doing interviews on COVID and the terrible response of many states to COVID by placing draconian restrictions like lockdowns, shutting down schools, mask and vaccine mandates. He is an epidemiologist and a professor of medicine at Stanford University. He has been one of the most important voices in pushing back against these destructive policies that we have seen over the past few years. And now that we are seeing universities and cities, districts, public schools re-implementing some of these mandates that have been proven to fail, I wanted to get his perspective. So we are going to talk to him about that, what the response should have been and should be. We are also going to talk about this study that recently came out about SSRIs, depression medications, and why they are so ineffective. It is apparently because this theory of chemical imbalance is causing depression is actually not true. So he's going to give us his response to that. And then we are also going to talk about this terrible story of this Alzheimer's medication fraud and what that means, what happened there, and what the consequences are and what accountability should look like. Then he's going to give us some recommendations for how we can reform public health and how public health entities can win back public trust. As always, this episode is brought to you by our friends at Good Ranchers. Go to goodranchers.com/Allie. That's goodranchers.com/Allie. So the theme that you are going to hear in this conversation is that science is not God. Scientists are not infallible. That's what I kept on taking away from what he was saying about how science changes, how it evolves, how it should evolve based on facts, based on the information that we have. And when someone like Tony Fauci says before Congress that I am science and anyone who disagrees with me disagrees with science, that is extremely it's symbolic, it's representative of where our public health entities, where the scientific community, if you will, has gone. It's gone from trying to find the facts and trying to come to conclusions based on those facts and then communicating those conclusions truthfully to the public to really a kind of scientism, a kind of religion, basically asserting that scientists who have a particular position, if that position is held by those who are in power, is infallible and it's indisputable. And this is the danger, of course, of replacing God with anything, but particularly of science. People say that we have to trust the science, we should follow the science. But look, science is created, investigated, and discovered by human beings who are fallible. And ultimately, all of science, all of the world was created by a God who is infallible. So we cannot place the same faith in science or so-called science as we do in the God who is immutable, unchangeable, who is the authority over what is and what isn't, what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's false. And we have seen the deadly consequences of switching the God of Scripture with the God of science over the past few years. So today, with Dr. Bhattacharya, we are going to talk specifically about what those consequences have looked like and where we have so disastrously got it wrong and how we can, in the future, get it right. So without further ado, here is epidemiologist and professor Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. Dr. Bhattacharya, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Nice to be here. Thank you, Allie.
Yes. So you were dubbed in the beginning of COVID and looking at our COVID response as the anti-lockdown voice. Of course, you had a lot of conservative media who wanted to talk to you and gain your insight. And then you had some left-wing media who opposed you and who, I don't know if they really scientifically disagreed with you, but they didn't like your message. Tell us what it has been like over the past couple of years, kind of being deemed the voice of anti-lockdowns during COVID.
I mean, for me now, it's a source of pride. I think I was right
Yes.
in 2020, and I'm it's been the right strategy. I have to say it's been shocking to me to see the political polarization. I spent my career writing scientific papers. I would write papers that go into journals, and 15 to 50 people would read it and be all excited about it. And then in 2020 to all of a sudden be thrust into the national spotlight over what I thought of as just basic epidemiology is still absolutely stunning to me. It's been I mean, in many ways it's been very, very difficult. Like a lot of my lost friends,
Right.
the Stanford hasn't really treated me all that well. But I've also had the opportunity to meet some incredible people and to participate in some of the most important policy decisions that I will ever have the privilege to participate in. So it's been good in that way.
It's been interesting. I'm sure that you didn't think that you were going to be thrust into the middle of a political debate when you were giving your epidemiological position, right?
I mean, I'll know the pandemic is well and truly over when I no longer get invited to podcasts, Allie.
Right. I know. It's a sign of the times that I messaged you on Twitter to have you come on, but I'm thankful for it. For those who may not know, can you just kind of summarize what your position has been on the COVID restrictions that have been implemented, especially the ones that you and I both would agree are draconian, like shutting down businesses and schools?
Yeah. So basically, the key idea that's motivated me throughout the pandemic is first you have to get good data on who are actually at risk from COVID in terms of bad outcomes. And if you look at the data from the very earliest days of the pandemic, it was very clear that it was really older people and certain people, some chronic conditions, but mostly it's older people that face an elevated risk of mortality. I did a study early in the pandemic measuring the mortality rate of the disease, and it so that there's thousandfold difference in the risk of dying. Maybe like if you're over the age of 70, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%, very high risk, especially if you're in a nursing home, of dying if you get infected. Whereas if you're younger, and it's very, very low. People under the age of 70, maybe 99.95% survival, and this was before the vaccine. So there's this huge gradient in risk in terms of the bad outcomes from the disease. At the same time, the lockdowns themselves that we adopted, especially the more draconian ones, are absolutely deadly, right? So just take children, right? We locked children out of school in so many states, and actually many places around the world did this. And yet we know from a huge literature that precedes the pandemic that this is actually very bad for the health of children throughout their entire lives. Children that skip even short periods of school have shorter, less healthy, poorer lives. That's essentially what we've consigned a very large number of our kids to. For young adults, the psychological effects are just devastating of these lockdowns. 1 in 4 young adults seriously considered suicide in June of 2020. So my position has been that it's not ethical to harm young people to protect them against a disease for which they face very low risk by lockdowns. We should not be doing lockdowns for younger people. Whereas for older people, what needs to happen is very creative engagement with public health professionals to understand how to protect them. Focused protection of the old. So those are the basic 2 tenets of how I've been thinking about the right policy. Pay attention to epidemiological risk stratification, lift the lockdowns, focus protection for the old.
Just to emphasize what you're talking about when it comes to consequences on children, there have been several studies now that have been published in the past year proving this. The Telegraph reported on one study that showed that COVID lockdowns left toddlers unable to speak or play properly. And I'm sure that it wasn't just the lockdowns, but it was also probably the masking of their teachers and even their parents, whether it's daycare, kindergarten, first grade teachers. The Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists raised fear that the gaps being witnessed now could widen in coming years. The the disparities are 79, or it says, the Office for Health Improvement and Disparity show that 79.6% of children who received a review last autumn met the expected level in all 5 areas of development measured. But of course, that is down from years prior. And so tell me what you think about the consequences that I don't even know if we've begun to see the full extent of the consequences that we are going to see on child development, on language development, on their ability to normally socially interact and communicate with one another. That really makes me nervous as a mom.
I mean, it makes me nervous too as a dad. I mean, although my kids are a little older now, but other than they face their own challenges as a result of the lockdowns. The effect on young kids is almost incalculable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you teach a kid to read over Zoom?
Right.
I mean, that's essentially what we decided that we were going to do for a very large number of kids. And, and it is one of these things where, like, you think, okay, well, it's just a couple of years, we can fix it. But, those are crucial time in the development of children.
Mm-hmm.
Fixing it is a major challenge. It's not even, may not be possible for many kids. And the level of disengagement, really, it wasn't equal throughout society, right? It's poorer families. It's minority families that pay the bigger cost of this.
Right.
If you had to, both parents had to work, or if you were a single parent household, what do you do when you have a young child, you have to work, and they have to go out, learn on Zoom,
Right.
and lots and lots of what happens for development requires children to be in community with other children, which just normally happens during schooling, during just, it's part of the way that kids learn is by being with other adults, being with other kids. And so it's not surprising that we're seeing this. And the only question in my mind is how do we address these deficits that we caused? I think we absolutely need to have an all hands on deck approach to try to fix this. It's a major problem. Whether it's possible is not clear.
Yes, and to your point about this disproportionately impacting communities that we would typically call marginalized, or however you want to describe it, special needs kids, of course, bore the brunt of this. I talked to a lot of speech therapists that listen to this podcast that their job was basically rendered impossible because they were forced to wear masks when they are trying to teach, whether it's a toddler, young kid, or whether it's an older kid with special needs, autism, whatever it is, how to pronounce words. It's impossible. The biggest aspect really of speech therapy is showing, not just allowing them to listen to how a word is pronounced, but showing them how to pronounce the words. I don't know if those kids even if we have all hands on deck, I'm not confident that those kids are ever going to be able to make up for the time and the care lost. And it's strange to me how that has become almost a partisan position. Maybe it's not anymore, but it certainly was, that you were deemed uncompassionate if you said, hey, there are going to be some long-term consequences for these underserved communities over here.
I mean, the American Association of Pediatrics actually put out a position saying that there was no evidence of deficits caused by masking. I mean, I was absolutely stunned. Like, how do they know? And for older kids, for kids in middle school or high school, the learning deficit is shocking. Grade school even. You have like fourth graders who can do math barely at a first grade level.
Yeah.
You have not surprising given that we've disrupted 3 years of schools in some places. You have like kids that just they don't know how to read very well. And again, it's very, very unequal. If it's young, it's older. It's poorer people, poor families, working class families that have had a much more difficult time making sure that the kids don't have these deficits. I look at the devastation caused by the school closures, and I am absolutely stunned. I worked actually in summer and early fall of 2020. I helped with this lawsuit. I advised this lawsuit that Governor DeSantis had decided to open the schools in Florida in fall of 2020. Issued this order, and he was sued by the Florida teachers unions. They actually had trouble finding an expert on our side to say, look, it's wrong to close the schools.
Right.
And so this is one of my proudest moments. Is like I got to help with that lawsuit. We actually lost, like, because in the sort of like the district court. I mean, I was shocked because, I mean, it was clear the judge didn't understand the science at all. It didn't really fully appreciate the importance of keeping schools open. And we finally won in the Florida Court of Appeals. So the school stayed open. Well, again, one of my proudest moments is to be able to help with that lawsuit.
All right, let me tell you about our first sponsor for the day. That is Eden Pure. This is an air purifier for your home. We use several of these in our home. We absolutely love it. If you've got odors in your home, litter boxes, trash cans, cigarette smoke, dirty diapers, cooking smells, this air purifier gets rid of those odors and freshens your home so you never have to worry about breathing dirty air again. They use oxy technology that quickly destroys the viruses, the odors, the mold, and a lot more. So it's not just masking the smell, it's actually getting rid of the particles that are causing the smells. The Thunderstorm, their air purifier, takes up no floor space. You just plug it directly into the wall. It's super quiet. We've got some in different rooms of our home, and it really does make a big difference. You can also travel with you. Stick it in the outlet in your hotel room. Works really well. Go to EdenPureDeals.com. Use discount code Allie to save $200. That's 3 Thunderstorm air purifiers for under $200, and shipping is free. EdenPureDeals.com. Discount code Allie. EdenPureDeals.com. Code Allie. Well, it does seem like many of the so-called experts, and certainly bureaucrats, people in charge, teachers unions, really don't care about the facts available still after all this time. You've got San Diego school districts saying that they are going to re-implement the mask mandates. Look, we've got data upon data showing that mask mandates don't actually lower the case level. They don't actually bring down the fatality rate. I mean, that is not even arguable at this point. And of course, I've seen you retweet David Zwig. He is a journalist who has talked about the CDC studies that said that they prove that mask mandates in schools work and how faulty those studies are. They don't actually prove what the summary of the studies say that they prove. And so we're still back to these teachers unions, to these administrators, these politicians just wanting to, quote, do something, whether or not there is any benefit. And there's not. There's actually only harm to these kids. And it's really hard for me to understand at this point what the motivation could be.
I'd say if you go back to before 2020, there was an excellent literature on the effectiveness of mask mandates in slowing the spread of flu. Now, flu spreads in similar ways to COVID. It spreads via aerosolization events. You know, you breathe. Your breath contains tiny particles that sit in the air forever, moisture particles that contain the virus. So if you're in a poorly ventilated room, when those aerosols come out, the aerosols are like clouds, droplets are like rain. The masks may stop the droplets, but they don't really stop the aerosols. If you wear glasses and your glasses get fogged up when you breathe through a mask, that's an aerosol escaping. There are a dozen randomized trials from before the pandemic with the flu, good, high-quality randomized trials that found that mask mandates in community settings, and actually even sometimes in hospital settings, have a very difficult time slowing the spread or stopping the spread of the flu. That was the science before the pandemic. Nothing's changed. The 2 randomized trials that have been done since the pandemic started, both in adults, not in children, found very small or zero effects of protection by masking. And we still, to this date, have not a single randomized study that shows that masking in children actually stops the disease spread. And, there's lots of reasons to think it doesn't. Children are not particularly good at wearing masks, especially young children.
Of course.
The World Health Organization doesn't recommend masking children below the age of 6, but, you have New York City masking toddlers up until just a couple months ago. And, the European CDC doesn't recommend masking kids below the age of 12 on the basis of that might cause them some harm. I mean, and if you look at the districts that wore masks, that mandated masks in kids versus districts that didn't. You find no difference over and over again in these. Whenever you do a careful study that doesn't cherry pick the data, so I just don't understand what science people are looking at when they demand mask mandates. It's as if they have told themselves this story about how effective they are, but that just isn't consistent with what the scientific data show.
You've been in epidemiology for several decades, for a long time now, so you must have been familiar with Anthony Fauci. Maybe that you've worked with him before. I don't know if you have, but certainly you said that you've been at Stanford for 35 years. I'm sure that you knew who Anthony Fauci was, his work in the AIDS epidemic. Tell me your reaction to, or what you think about his leadership and his response to COVID over the past few years. Does it surprise you at all?
I had a lot of respect for him at the beginning of the pandemic. I have on my bookshelf a textbook that he edited, Harrison's Internal Medicine, which is sort of the one of the key texts in training internal medicine doctors that I read when I was in training in medical school. And of course, he's had this incredibly long career. He's played such an important role in so many parts of American science. During the pandemic, I have been absolutely shocked by his leadership, and I don't know how to say this in a more polite way. I mean, I think he's a failed leader. Probably the worst moment was I saw him talking with Senator Paul, I think, in a Senate hearing where Senator Paul was just asking him questions, and Tony Fauci's response was, "Well, if you're questioning me, you're not simply questioning a man; right. You are questioning science itself."
Yeah,
I that kind of hubris is absolutely shocking to me. Like you cannot have anybody at the top of the American scientific bureaucracy thinking that he himself is science beyond questioning. And what he's done is if you want to characterize exactly the kind of action he's done, he believes that he is right beyond all question. And then anyone challenging him is therefore on the fringe and dangerous. And he's acted in ways essentially to create this illusion of consensus, scientific consensus around his policy preferences, which are essentially locked down. And delegitimize or push to the edge or call fringe anyone who disagrees with them, even if they have sort of good scientific data and arguments. It's not the way that a scientific science bureaucracy or public health ought to behave. Public health can't work unless it's truly rooted in science. And the scientific discussion around what the right policy is not, there's no consensus. There hasn't been, even though the media and Tony Fauci has pushed this idea that there is.
Yeah.
And I think that's to me is the biggest disappointment. He has violated the norms, the ethics, the sort of like sacred obligation of scientific leaders to permit that scientific discussion to happen. He's essentially killed science around the science of COVID as a consequence of his hubris.
Right. Well, he has to have the same knowledge that you do, especially when it comes to masking. And it seems like he did. In the beginning, there was this March 2020, I believe, interview where he basically said, look, you can wear a mask if it makes you feel better, but we can't rely on it really to stop the spread of it. And that seemed like a pretty common sense position with what we knew about COVID. But then that really changed. Not only should you mask, but you have to double mask, even if those two masks are, only the cloth masks, which we know don't have a great they're not very effective. And so it was interesting to see his positions change so much based on, I'm not sure what, the politics of it, whatever the CCP was doing. That's another disturbing aspect of it, that we have tried to actually, in some ways, model our response to what the CCP has done, which is still locking down millions of people in Shanghai today. And so I wish I knew a little bit more about what went on behind the scenes and in those conversations where he decided that he was going to reject and ignore the science and the studies that we both know that he knew about in favor of mask mandates and policies that we know were ineffective.
I mean, on masks, it's really funny. Like he early in the pandemic, as you say, Allie, he said that mask mandates work, that masks don't work. and I mean, there he was reflecting what the prior literature said with these high quality randomized studies. Then he changed his mind and then admitted to lying before, a noble lie in order to preserve high quality masks for medical personnel.
Which is horrible.
Okay, so that itself means that if you have a public health leader who admits to lying to you, that just demolishes the trust that people have in you. I mean, it's stunning to see that people haven't responded. I mean, actually, that's not true. Many people now distrust him, and I think that the start of that was that admitting that he was lying then. But the ironic thing is that actually in February 2020, his position on masks that they don't work was not a lie. That was the truth. That was what the medical literature was saying at the time. In fact, when he said he was lying later, that itself was a lie. So I just it's a funny thing. I mean, in public health, you have this like sacred obligation to tell the public the truth all the way across, or you lose your credibility. To the best I mean, you could be wrong. It's very easy to be wrong when you have a rapidly changing science the way we have. But the public will forgive you. But to lie knowingly, and then admit to lying knowingly, and then lie about lying, that's something else.
Okay, quick pause to tell you about one of my favorite sponsors, one of my favorite companies ever, and that is Carly Jean Los Angeles. My team was like, hey, you've got a Carly Jean ad tomorrow. Make sure you're wearing Carly Jean clothes. And I was like, well, I am wearing Carly Jean clothes pretty much every single episode, so that's not a problem. And lo and behold, I am wearing Carly Jean, my Carly Jean top and my Carly Jean pants. And guess what is the best part about this tank and pants? Yes, they're comfortable. Yes, they're cute, if I do say so myself. Super flattering. But also, both pieces made in the U.S. Their entire basics line made in the USA. How incredible is that? It's so hard to find good quality pieces of clothing today that are actually made in the U.S. and Carly Jean Los Angeles has a ton. Plus, this is a company run by people who love the Lord. They've got the same values that we do. You can feel really good about sending your money there. If you go to carlyjeanlosangeles.com and use promo code AllieBasic, you save 20% off your first order of USA-made basics. carlyjeanlosangeles.com, promo code AllieBasic. That's carlyjeanlosangeles.com. I don't understand why Donald Trump didn't fire him, why he was able to stick around as long as he did. Donald Trump made a statement in a speech yesterday that he just did the opposite of everything that Anthony Fauci said. But of course, that's not true. That's actually not a true statement. Unfortunately, even though I personally think there were a lot of good parts of the Trump presidency, to me, one of the shameful parts was how much he listened to Deborah Birx and Anthony Fauci and allowed them to lead in the way that they did. I mean, that kicked off the terrible and draconian COVID response that we've had.
Yeah, I mean, I actually sort of had a front row seat in this because my friend Scott Atlas, Dr. Scott Atlas, who's
we've had him on as well.
Oh, you have? Oh, fantastic. Yes. President Trump actually selected him in July as his personal advisor on COVID policy. But he brought him in the context of the leadership of the COVID the COVID commission by Deborah Birx, and of course advised and led behind the scenes by Tony Fauci. Both of them, I think, were actually selected by Vice President Pence. And to Scott Atlas, he tried to bring me, Martin Kulldorff, Joe Ladapo, who's now the Surgeon General of Florida, and this very prominent pediatrician from Tufts, into the White House to advise the president, just to have a meeting with him, just to tell him, look, there are scientists out there that disagree with Tony Fauci and the lockdowns. And I think Trump's instincts were in that direction. That's why he hired Scott. Yeah. But the problem was that, you're the president of the United States. You've decided in the middle of a war to change strategies. You bring in a new general, and then you leave the old generals around to destroy the reputation of the new general you bring in. I mean, Tony Fauci and Birx were using their media power to absolutely demolish the reputation of Scott Atlas in that summer. They viewed him as a mortal threat to their authority, which he was. right? And in fact, if you read Debbie Berg's book, she admits that she essentially worked to manipulate the president and get lockdowns in place successfully. She subverted the president of the United States, asserted her authority over and above the president of the United States. And I have to tell you, in terms of like Donald Trump himself, the shocking thing to me is that he didn't fire them. He didn't fire Birx and Fauci, even though I think he might have wanted to, because he was afraid that if he did, he would not get reelected.
Yeah, right.
That's not, in my mind, an excusable thing, right? The health of the American public comes above and beyond your reelection campaign. Even if you lose reelection, you should do the right thing on such a critical point. It's a huge disappointment to me that he didn't. He suspected and very strongly understood that they were advising him incorrectly, and still he left them on because if the political advisors were telling him, and he agreed with the political advisors, that if he fired them, he would lose the election. That's not acceptable to me.
Yeah, of course. And I think the only people that really would have cared about that were the people that weren't going to vote for him anyway. I don't think it would have made that much of a difference. You wouldn't think this about Trump, but he actually does care a little bit more than you'd think what people on the left think. Everyone wants to be liked. I think that's a normal thing, but I think that that's kind of what got him, is that he did not trust his instincts there, and he didn't go the direction of that people like you or Scott Atlas would have advised. Let me read a little segment by Deborah Birx. She said, "I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection, and I think we overplayed the vaccines, and it made people then worry that it's not going to protect against severe disease and hospitalization." And then, so she's basically admitting another part of what I would call the manipulation, or kind of how she communicated things to the public and to the media versus what she really thought, is that she thought that the vaccines really weren't going to be very effective, and yet they sold them as if they were. I mean, we heard over and over again from the media, from Anthony Fauci, from Joe Biden, from Rachel Maddow, that if you get this vaccine, you will not get the virus and you won't spread it. That's why a lot of people got it. And not only that, that's why a lot of companies mandated it. And people lost their jobs over this because of this assertion that the vaccine was going to stop the disease in its tracks. That's obviously not what happened. What do you make of that?
She's lying. All right. So I'll just tell you, like, if she actually believed that, she would have come out strongly against the mandates in 2021. I'll tell you, when the science and the timeline of the science is really important here. In December of 2020, what we knew was based on two very large randomized studies done, actually three large randomized studies done on the J&J vaccine and the two mRNA vaccines. From those, the end point of those studies was not prevention of severe disease. In fact, they didn't enroll enough patients to actually measure whether there was a statistically significant effect on reduction of severe disease. It wasn't even prevention of transmission, because the studies actually didn't look at transmission, and the studies didn't look at whether people had any infection at all. It didn't actually have as an endpoint the prevention of all infection. It had as the endpoint the prevention of symptomatic infection. This is a disease that can spread asymptomatically. That's true. So what that means is that, you know that it's preventing symptomatic infection for about 3 or 4 months. That's what the randomized studies showed in December of 2020. That left you with having to make a guess. There's two epidemiologically meaningful endpoints here. One is prevention of severe disease, and the other is prevention of transmission. Right? I heard Birx say this. They made a guess based on hope that would stop transmission. Now, why is that important? If it stops transmission, then that means, and the protection lasts a long time, then that means the vaccine can be used essentially to suppress the spread of the disease effectively to zero, as long as sufficient number of people get vaccinated. You heard Birx, Fauci say this. We just need to get 60, 70, 80%, the number kept going up, of the population vaccinated, and the disease will go, and effectively they were implying that the disease would go away, because they assumed, not based on the evidence, but based on an extrapolation from a trial, which turned out to be false, that it would stop transmission. In fact, as soon as it hit the real world, it was clear that it didn't stop transmission. You had a heavily vaccinated societies like Israel very early on, March, April, May, I forget exactly the timeline of 2021, seeing very large COVID spread, large amounts of COVID spread. That meant the vaccine doesn't stop spread, as we found out, so to our detriment here. So that means that the vaccine can't be used to stop the disease from spreading. It can't even be used for herd immunity unless you force people to get vaccinated every 3 or 4 months. And even then, it's not clear, because then multiple boosters may not actually stop the spread of the disease for very long. It might be diminishing returns to that. So you have this situation where they extrapolate, including Debbie Birx, above and beyond what the evidence actually showed. On the other hand, the protection against severe disease, actually, I extrapolated there. I wrote an op-ed in December of 2020 in the Wall Street Journal with Sunetra Gupta of Oxford. We argued that the vaccine should be used to protect older people against severe disease, essentially to use the vaccine as a way of focused protection of the old. That extrapolation turned out to be right. The vaccine does actually decrease the odds of dying or going to the hospital if you get infected. And what we argued in that Wall Street Journal article was, you vaccinate older populations, that's as good as protection as you're going to get that we have available to us, and then lift the lockdowns, right? You've essentially done perfect focused protection, as good as focused protection as we possibly can do, and then we lift the lockdowns. That was the right way to use the vaccine. It turns out, because it does actually protect against severe disease. I think the FDA and Trump White House should have been calling for a vaccine trial that actually had a very large number of older people in it to see if it could protect against severe disease. We could have made that decision much more confidently in December of 2020. But it seemed clear to me that if it protects against symptomatic infection, then it must also protect against severe disease, hospitalizations and deaths. And so that turned out to be right. And it turns out to be more durable. Like, I think 8-9 months after the vaccine, you still are getting pretty good protection against severe disease. Although I think it does diminish after a certain, maybe 9 months, a year. In any case, the right thing then is to lift the lockdowns, vaccinate the old, lift the lockdowns. Instead, we had this crazy policy of continuing the lockdowns, force vaccinating people, violating their informed consent, as you said, Allie, like people losing jobs.
Yes.
Their religious conscience violated, because some of these vaccines are developed using fetal cell lines. I think one of these, it basically tore society in two, created an underclass of people out of people who were just making decisions that they viewed as good for their health or consistent with their values, and really undermined the authority and trust that people had in public health.
Yes, definitely. Now, what do you make of the concerns around heart issues, myocarditis? Do you think that is being overblown, or do you think that is a sincere concern and a reason for people in a particular age group not to get it?
Yeah, the evidence is abundantly clear from everywhere where these mRNA vaccines have been used, especially in young men. The risk of myocarditis is elevated. Myocarditis is inflammation of the heart, the heart muscle, and it can be deadly. It certainly can be debilitating. It is very clearly a side effect of this vaccine. The estimates I've seen range between 1 in 1,000 people, young men who get the vaccine, to 1 in, say, 5,000. It'll be somewhere in that range, who have myocarditis as a consequence of having got the vaccine. If I were in my early 20s as a young man, I would worry about that. Because the protection against severe disease from the vaccine isn't actually all that important, because I have very low risk, if I were in my 20s, from dying if I get COVID. Whereas 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 5,000 of myocarditis is actually, I just don't want that. And it turns out that it doesn't protect you against getting COVID. Right. So you still get the risk of myocarditis from COVID too. So it just doesn't. It makes no sense to mandate it for a population for whom it's not clear whether there's a net positive benefit.
Mm-hmm. Now, we heard Dr. Peter McCullough, when he was on Joe Rogan, he said then that from the knowledge and the information that he had at that point, that natural immunity was permanent. Now, we know that that's not true. I know many people who have gotten COVID twice. What is the benefit of natural immunity? Would you say that it is better than the protection that you get from the vaccine, or is it something that should be totally discounted like it seems like the public health experts have done?
Yeah, so in October 2020, when I wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, this idea to lift the lockdowns and do focused protection of the old, it was very clear from the biological literature that and the immunological literature that there was actually pretty significant protection provided by recovery from COVID. Right, you have all these immune responses, including T cells and B cells and antibody production, that lasted up to 6 months already, that protected you against, in fact, against reinfection. Up until Omicron, there were all these studies that suggested, the disease hit in Italy very early, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a study in Italy tracking people who had got COVID very early in the pandemic over a full year, and they found that only 3 in 1,000 had been reinfected over the course of that year. Now, when Omicron hit, even people who had previously been infected and recovered started getting infected again. So Omicron evades natural immunity, and it also evades the immunity provided by the vaccine. Like a lot of people who had been vaccinated started getting sick. Actually, I got Delta, so I had the vaccine in April of 2021, and then I got COVID in August of 2021. So the vaccine didn't protect against infection even in the early days before Omicron, but certainly after Omicron, you had this vaccine immune evasion. The key thing is, you had a probability of getting sick, even though you've been previously infected and recovered, the risk of severe disease in Omicron was actually lower than the first time. Most people, the vast majority of people who get it the second time, are less likely to end up in the hospital, less likely to die from it the second time, and that's going to be true for the rest of your life. I think. I mean, you're gonna get this disease over and over and over again for the rest of your life if there's other immune evasion variants. But it seems to me like what is permanent is the protection against getting very, 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 very sick if you've had the COVID before and recovered.
All right, another pause to tell you about our third sponsor for the day, and that is Crowd Health. What if you could have your healthcare put back in your own hands instead of it being sold to the highest bidder? Politicians, big pharma, health insurance companies make enormous profits at the expense of your health, and that is where Crowd Health comes in. Love this company, love this service. It's not health insurance, but it is a form of healthcare coverage. You can see any doctor you want. You just pay the first $500 and then you submit any bills from there, and the Crowd Health community takes care of the rest. So no doctor networks, no huge premiums or deductibles. Best of all, no surprises. This can be a real game changer in the community, or this is a real game changer in the community healthcare industry. It can be a huge game changer for you and your family. You just pay one low monthly total, less than $200 a month for most people. So stop paying health insurance companies your hard-earned dollars. Go to joincrowdhealth.com now and experience freedom from health insurance. Right now, you can get your first 6 months for only $99 a month. That is incredible. That's almost 50% off the normal price and a lot less than a high-deductible healthcare plan. Just go to joincrowdhealth.com, use code Allie to sign up. Joincrowdhealth.com, promo code Allie. It's not health insurance. It's a totally different way of paying for healthcare. Terms and conditions may apply. It's just sad knowing all that we know. I mean, the information, the facts that you're talking about really are available to everyone. There seems to be something in the minds of both just the general population and those who are in charge, experts, whatever. I'm not saying it's completely nefarious on everyone's part, but there seems to be an inability or unwillingness to see that which is true. Either it's for political reasons or they've convinced themselves that this is these are the right politics, or this is the compassionate position to take when it comes to mask mandates and vaccine mandates. But really, when you look at the consequences of it, especially on young people, on vulnerable people, when it comes to mask and vaccine mandates, even at universities and the public school system, it's really sad to me. I think one of the saddest parts is that no one is going to be, certainly right now, no one is being held accountable. And I'm just not sure if anyone is ever going to be held accountable. I mean, you're talking about people who have died. I mean, I'm not saying that it is prevalent, that it is happening every day, but have died from taking this vaccine, or they have adverse health outcomes from taking the vaccine that was mandated. They were going to lose their job, or they weren't going to be able to go back to college because of this. And it just kind of seems like people are throwing their hands up in the air. And not only that, they're willing to do it again. That's really scary to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that public health bureaucrats have ignored science on natural immunity. I mean, essentially, they've spread misinformation on natural immunity, the effectiveness of mass, of the fact that there is this enormous risk gradient. They've overstated the effectiveness of the vaccines in terms of stopping disease transmission and spread. All of these things are, have been absolutely shocking for me to watch, because these are not really all that controversial in the medical literature.
Right.
Instead, what you have is you have even prominent doctors trying to toe the propaganda line instead of reflecting what actually the medical literature is saying in order to push their preferred policy. It's a shocking violation of the public trust.
Yeah.
I think maybe what you're getting at, and I completely agree with, and I don't have a great answer, is how do you regain that trust? How do you reform the medical profession and public health so that it becomes worthy of that trust again? I think the first thing, and I just still haven't seen it, is an open acknowledgement of error. That look, we were trying our best, we made mistakes. I'll have to say, a lot of the people, especially in the public health bureaucracies, acted in ways that were just hard to impute good faith to them.
Right.
I think a lot of them were mistaken in good faith about the science, but then they were loath to admit that they were wrong. Mm-hmm. And then they pushed policies just take natural immunity, like immunity after COVID recovery. That was a basic fact. You could see it in the data, and yet they pushed it, ignoring it. They
called it a myth. They called it a conspiracy theory. Anyone who talked about natural immunity, I mean, for the first time probably in epidemiological history, someone who talked about natural immunity was pushed to the side as some kind of crazy kook.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't love the term natural immunity. It's COVID recovery,
Gotcha.
Immunity after COVID recovery. But I mean, because it's that natural immunity might be a little bit ambiguous. But I agree with I think with HIV, you get infected, you don't get immunity. But for the vast majority of viruses, certainly respiratory viruses, certainly for all the coronaviruses, you get infected and you are provided protection against both reinfection and against severe disease. For a long time, you've had coronaviruses for sure. If you're for a human, there are 4 or 5 coronaviruses that are in common human circulation. You probably had it first when you were little, very little, and then you recovered from it. It was a cold, and then the next time you got it was another cold, and then another cold, another cold. The problem with this virus was that it was it was novel. Most people, the vast majority of us didn't have any protection against it, really. And so, some of us reacted very, when we got infected, we had this horrible viral pneumonia. And some it led to death. It was most severe because we were immune naive. The population now is no longer immune naive. The vast majority of the population has been infected and recovered. And of course, the vaccines provide protection against severe disease. By denying basic science, they pushed forward policies that have been incredibly socially divisive, harmed the lives of millions and millions. Actually, and the lockdowns themselves caused death and destruction on a level that's just unimaginable. I think there was an estimate that we with all this economic destruction we caused with these lockdowns led to 100 million people around the world thrown into dire poverty, less than $2 a day of income, with millions and millions of children starving as a consequence. I think the UN actually put an estimate in early 2021 that 230,000 children had died of starvation as a consequence of the economic dislocation caused by lockdowns in South Asia alone. So these lies have had consequences on the lives of so many, really negative ones.
And wow, this is a Christian podcast. And so one thing that we heard within some people in the church was that these mandates, these policies that we would call draconian, were all about loving your neighbor. Well, there's always a flip side of that. When you're talking about kids thrown into poverty, when you're talking about some of the consequences that we talked about in the beginning, the increase in child abuse that we saw in this country, not to mention, I'm sure, what also was seen worldwide, that doesn't seem like a very good way to love your neighbor. I want to stay in this theme of the distrust of public health institutions that we are seeing, that really has grown over the past few years. I wouldn't have described myself as someone who is distrustful or really questioned what doctors or epidemiologists or Anthony Fauci says, because I don't have a medical degree. But over the past few years, I am one of millions and millions of Americans who have started to question the recommendations that we are getting from the people who call themselves public health experts. And it seems like there are new studies and new stories every day that kind of reaffirm that suspicion and that lack of trust that a lot of us have. One of them recently was about the effectiveness of SSRIs in treating depression. So for those who don't know, SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. These are typically the medications given to people who have depression, because we have been told for a very long time that chemical imbalance and low serotonin is what causes depression. And there was a study that came out in the Journal of Molecular Psychiatry that said, well, not really. It's not really a chemical imbalance. It's not really about low serotonin. And all of these medications that have been given to people for depression probably haven't been working for a lot of people because the premise was wrong. So, I mean, again, you're talking about something that has had massive, massive consequences on people based on what seems like kind of faulty science. What is your take on all of that?
I mean, when I went to medical school in the mid 90s, one of my professors told me, half of what we're teaching you is not true. The problem is you're not going to know which half until much later. Science does change. Like we think about science as this exalted knowledge of a source of ultimate truth.
Right.
But it's not. What it is provisional knowledge. Like, okay, given what we know and what we've seen, based on like open discussion and experimentation and testing, here's our guess. Now, like the idea that serotonin, low levels of serotonin are really at root of the dark times of the soul people can have during depression, always seemed to me is like overly simplistic. Mm. And so in some sense, I'm not surprised that there's a revision of this view. There's got to be more to depression than simply low serotonin levels, or you can just, or SSRIs would have fixed all depression. In fact, depression levels are quite high still. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you're on SSRI, it won't help you. I mean, I think a lot of people have been helped by SSRIs. Mm-hmm. And as you say, Allie, a lot of people haven't been. I think the right way to look about that result is that we do not understand in any really truly deep way what causes some people to be depressed, and a way to address it is multifaceted, and I think a drug may not be the way to help it for many people. I think as many people who've been on SSRIs have found out, and I think like expecting the healthcare system to solve those kinds of problems, with 100% certainty, where we just don't understand in any deep way exactly what causes them, I think is asking too much. We exalted science. We put it as the sort of the highest source of all truth, when in fact, if you do science for a living, really, my impression is one of humility before how much we don't actually still know. There's a lot we do know, but there's a lot we don't know. And what makes science exciting and fun is this thing where you can like discover together as a community what is true and what isn't. You can have these fun fights with people, tempered by data, tempered by experiment, that slowly reveal how the world works. And I think that's the spirit in which I look at that study. I mean, the problem has been the last 20 some years or 20 30 years is we've overemphasized this chemical imbalance idea as a source of knowledge about what caused it. And before that, it was the Freudian idea. It was like what happened to you when you were little. With how your mom treated you or something. All of these like simplistic ideas cannot possibly encapsulate why we have depression, why we have these are like big human things, and to pretend we have a mechanistic understanding that's comprehensive to explain it all is always seemed to me as hubris.
Last sponsor for the day, you know them, you love them, and that is Good Ranchers. You guys know, we talked about earlier this week on Monday, they are trying to make us eat bugs, crickets, locusts, mealworms. I don't know about you, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to keep eating hamburgers and T-bone steaks and ribeyes and seafood and better than organic chicken, pre-marinated, not pre-marinated, all from Good Ranchers. They have their meat they get their meat all from American farms and ranchers. That's what I love about them. They're helping revitalize this industry in the United States. All the meat shows up right to your front door on dry ice, individually wrapped, vacuum sealed. You just put it all in your freezer. We got a deep freezer just for our Good Ranchers meat. I love it. I love knowing that one part of my meal every night is always taken care of. It's really, really good meat. We love Good Ranchers. Go to goodranchers.com/Allie. You can use code Allie to get $30 off your order plus free express shipping. Goodranchers.com/Allie. Code Allie for that discount. That's goodranchers.com/Allie. Speaking of hubris, to me, a lot of scientists exhibit a lot of hubris in saying things like trust the science, follow the science, and then marginalizing or intimidating anyone who, as you said, bringing their own facts to the table, their own data, their own perspective to the table, disagrees with what the majority opinion in the scientific community is. People are kind of pushed to the side as crazy or as kooky or as dumb for questioning things like masks or particular side effects of the vaccine. Of course, there were people who 20 years ago were even saying, hey, this whole idea of low serotonin levels being the sole driver of depression is probably not right. And they were cast as crazy, as quacks. That seems to be a big problem from my perspective in science in general, that eventually science seems to come around and catch up to what some, people were saying, some dissenters were saying, but it takes a lot. It takes a lot of courage for people like you to kind of stand against what people like Anthony Fauci are saying when it really shouldn't. It really shouldn't take courage. Like, you shouldn't really be worried, not you in particular, but no one should be worried about losing their job for saying, hey, here's what the science says. It's leading in a different direction. That to me shows that it's become less driven by facts, less driven by data, and more driven by, I don't even know, politics, power, money, pharmaceutical companies. All I know is that it doesn't seem to be about the well-being of the people that the scientific community is supposed to be serving.
I mean, there's all of what you said is entirely true. I mean, it's not like that it's new. There's this famous physicist named Max Planck who had this wry observation about how he said science advances one obituary at a time. Right. The idea is that there's this power structure within science, and people at the top of the hierarchy. There's a lot of ego. It's not even money of many people. They want to be seen as the smart ones, the wise ones, and challenges from to their intellectual authority are some of them react very negatively to it. Like in my case, for instance, when we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, Francis Collins, who was the head of the NIH at the time, the National Institute of Health, actually someone I admired. I mean, I'm Christian, and he's been an outspoken Christian in a position of authority in science. He wrote an email to Tony Fauci 4 days after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. We wrote it on October 4th, and October 8th, he wrote an email to Tony Fauci calling me, Sunetra Gupta, who's one of the world's best epidemiologists at Oxford University, and then Martin Kulldorff, one of the world's best biostatisticians at Harvard University. He called the three of us fringe epidemiologists.
Yeah.
And then he called for a devastating published takedown of us. And then I started getting calls from reporters asking me why I wanted to let the virus rip. In effect, why did I want to kill people?
Right, of course. That's what they do.
And I saw quotes from Tony Fauci and effectively, willfully sort of misinterpreting what we were arguing for in the Great Barrington Declaration, which is focus protection. They organized a media campaign to smear us and destroy us in order to maintain the illusion that they were right, that they had this consensus behind them in favor of lockdowns, when in fact the consensus never existed. The way that top scientists behave sets the tone for this kind of behavior. I mean, here in this case, they explicitly created a propaganda campaign in order to keep the public illusion that they were reflecting a consensus of science intact, when in fact there never was one. And I've got to show you. I have a card that I got that now has here we go. It has fringe epidemiologist on it.
There you go. Now you wear the title proudly. Wow. It's hard to even put into words how destructive that kind of attitude and those kinds of actions are. And yes, Francis Collins has been held up as kind of a hero, not just of science, but of the faith within Christian churches. I mean, he made his rounds to different churches during COVID, talking about the life-saving and also almost like the spiritually salvific power of like wearing a mask and forcing vaccines and things like that. So that was very disappointing. Just to end, I want to get your thoughts also on this Alzheimer's drug scandal. This was published in Science, and it looked at this 6-month investigation that provided really strong support for the fact that this drug and many of the drugs used to treat Alzheimer's, that the data had been manipulated to look like they're actually more effective than they are, when really they almost have a 100% failure rate. So we're talking about hubris and power and money and all of those things really coming together in one story, again, affecting disproportionately negatively the most vulnerable people among us, beloved grandparents who suffered and died from Alzheimer's, who put their hope in these drugs and were told, hey, maybe there's a good chance that they could work. And of course, they failed. What's your take on this story?
This one's even worse than the SSRI. The SSRI story is normal science. Like you have a new discovery which overturns an old idea.
Yeah.
Right. That's normal science. Here, what you have is a century-old idea that what causes dementias, or at least one of the major causes of dementia, is the development of plaques, amyloid plaques in your brain that cause the kind of like loss of memory and loss of all the things that are connected with dementia and Alzheimer's. That idea was century old. Like, and when I was in medical school, I was taught that this was potentially a cause of a lot of dementias, but you won't know unless you do an autopsy after someone's died to see if those plaques existed. That this was in the 90s. What happened after the 90s was that people developed scanning methods to measure the presence of amyloid plaques. And there was a study done, I think 16 years ago, published in a very prominent journal, that documented these plaques were very common. It turns out that that study, which was again published in a very influential journal, had a big influence on solidifying this amyloid hypothesis as a cause of Alzheimer's. Used fake data, like it was fraudulent. The study was just pure fraud. Wow. That's come out. That is exactly what's happened recently. Like that the exposure of that study is fraudulent has just come out. I mean, that happens in science too. Like, people, again, that you publish a paper in a top journal, all of a sudden you get invitations to conferences, you get grants, you get your social status rises among other scientists. You get tenure, and what's happened? What the problem there was that study, by confirming the century-old hypothesis, led drug developers to try to find drugs that could reduce the level of amyloid in your brain. And so we have a decade and a half of drug developers who very successfully created drugs that do that. But then when they run clinical trials on them, they don't actually help people, in terms of the slow deterioration of memory, all of the real problems that come from dementia. That turns out those drugs just don't work. So essentially, the main problem is that paper led to a decade and a half of a dead end, with billions of dollars thrown into research trying to address this amyloid problem, when in fact the problem still is how do you care for, how do you treat someone who has this slow deterioration of their memory, their capacity to function in society that comes with Alzheimer's and with dementia.
Yes. Oh, sad. I know this has been really hard to read for people who have had people in their lives who have suffered from Alzheimer's and maybe even took these drugs with the hope that they were going to help. This is a big question, but to close this out, if you were in charge of all health, just health in general in the United States. I mean, we're talking about you can make decisions for how the pharmaceutical companies run, for health policy, for how science is developed and then published and communicated to the media. What would be your biggest reforms? Like if you were put in charge of all of it and you got to make the decisions, how would you change things so that the public could trust the public health system and the entities involved again? Because right now the distrust is really high.
It's funny, Allie, because the key thing is that I would make myself not in charge. You have to have a very wide diversity of voices for a topic as complicated as that. And so the first thing I would do is I would bring in people that disagreed with me to sit there and to tell me I'm wrong. In terms of I think there's like several different kinds of issues around this. So for instance, take the NIH. The NIH funds the research of very many biologists and medical doctors and scientists who are working on health issues. It's really clear from the COVID pandemic that what's happened inside the NIH is that a very small number of people have decided that they know exactly exactly where all the right scientific investments are going to be, what's likely to produce the right results. Instead of diversifying the ideas that they support, even supporting ideas that they may not think are promising because they may be wrong, they've focused all their money and attention, and not the Alzheimer's example is a good example, on one set of hypotheses. You created this like concentrated power structure. And I think that needs to be disrupted. Funding in science should be very similar to funding in the tech world, where you don't know which company is going to work, and so what you do is you fund a very large number of companies. You expect many of them to fail, right? Because you don't know in advance. You diversify the portfolio. I think that kind of diversification desperately needs to happen in science funding. In public health. There just needs to be a recommitment to science and a recommitment to the values of the public, and an absolute commitment to never telling a noble lie again. The purpose of public health isn't to manipulate behavior of the public. The purpose of public health is to work with the public, give them as good information as possible to know, and then understand the needs and desires of the public so that together it can create situations where health can happen. The current idea in public health is so clearly this priesthood who knows better about how to manage you and manage the public, and they'll tell you what to do, and they'll be very disappointed when you disagree with them or don't obey them. And I'll tell you another thing in public health. It's become clear to me is that so many people in professional physicians in public health are on the left. Now, that by itself is not wrong. It's not bad. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that many of them look down on people on the right. It's become a political position for them as opposed to a professional position. And and what's happened is this political divide in public health, whereby if you are being dictated to, lectured to by people who you don't agree with politically, and look down on you because of your politics, you're not going to respond very well. Completely understandable. And so what's happened is you have this like political divide in public, but this public health where half the country just doesn't agree with, it just will not trust you because they think you're looking down on them. You have to diversify public health so that it has it reflects America. You cannot have one political stripe in charge of basically every aspect of public health, and which is where we are. And so if public health is going to regain the trust of America, it has to look like America, ideologically, I think. I wouldn't have said that before the pandemic, but it's clear that what's happened is public health cannot communicate with Red America in a way that's trustworthy because they are unable. In principle, they could if they respected. Even if you disagree with someone, you can respect them. But it seems to me like a lot of public health just doesn't respect people they disagree with politically. Yeah. And you just can't have that. So I would work very hard to reform that. Medicine also needs to return to evidence-based medicine. I mean, it's through the pandemic, it's become a tool of propaganda and of dissemination of public health messages. Medicine, for it to work, patients have to trust their doctor as looking out for their interests, not just for the public interest. Yeah. And I think that's been a big problem in medicine is that a lot of patients no longer trust doctors because they think that the doctors are out for something else other than their own health and well-being.
Yep, that's absolutely true. Well, thank you so much for those recommendations, and thank you so much for your insight as well. I really appreciate it, as well as just for your courage, your willingness to kind of get in the public arena and defend the scientific position. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.